Our first outing is to the infamous Fleet Street. There are several tube stations that serve it, but we've chosen Blackfriars, which is just a few hundred yards away. Fleet Street was once considered the most important location for printing and journalism in the world, with Britain's national newspapers making the street their home for centuries. Dave and I are taking a walk through history which began many centuries before, and we might well discover a pub or two on the way.
This street was established as a thoroughfare to Roman Londinium, whose walls enclosed an area roughly the size of the City of London. These walls can still be seen not far from here. By around AD 200, there was fair evidence that this was a major route leading west away from the city gate.
At the fall of the Roman Empire, Londinium was abandoned by the Saxons, who created Ludenwic in the area now known as Aldwych and the Strand. Fleet Street, nevertheless, retained its importance as a thoroughfare. In medieval times, it became lined with houses, shops and taverns, with gardens and yards behind. Narrow lanes subsequently developed behind those, which gradually evolved into a network of alleys or courts as they became known. By the 13th century, Fleet Street was flanked by ecclesiastical land, notably the buildings of the Knights Templar, based around the New Temple to the south. Today, the Inns of Court, London's centre for the Law Society, still remain. The time-locked lanes and tucked-away squares have witnessed some of the most important events in English history. Sadly, though, we don't have permission to film, but that's another undiscovered place for you to explore. In spite of the continuous development, almost unbelievably, most of the original medieval courts, lanes and alleys have remained intact, rebuilt around the same pattern after the Great Fire of London. So when did this famous street start its long history of printing?
Our history books tell us that the printing press came from Europe to England with William Caxton in 1476, but his talented apprentice Wynkyn de Voorde should be recognised for ensuring its continued success. After Caxton died, Wynkyn took over his business in Westminster and then moved to this lane just off Fleet Street in 1500.
He was the first printer to come to Fleet Street. With a ready-made customer base on his doorstep, the church and the legal fraternity, Wynkyn was able to produce many titles, in fact more than 800 publications in his time. He also improved the quality of Caxton's product a great deal, and is regarded as England's first typographer, bringing lower-priced books to a mass market. He used the sign of the sun as a trademark on his work. Dave and I strolled down Bouverie Street to find Magpie Alley, or Magpie Murals as it has been called. Tiled on its walls is a fascinating timeline of images and maps, all relating to the development of printing and the press. Here is a map of Fleet Street in de Voorde's day. Further down the alley, you can see the remains of the Whitefriars Carmelite Monastery, carefully preserved behind glass, incorporated into foundations on the site of the former News of the World building. Fleet Street contains many styles of architecture, representing hundreds of years of change and development. Perhaps the most distinctive is this wonderful half-timbered frontage from 1610, which contains a gateway to the inner temple.
Behind me is one of the few buildings left untouched by the Great Fire of London of 1666, Prince Henry's room. This is where the eldest son of King James I, Henry of Wales, had a room set aside on the first floor as his council chamber in this one-time tavern.
The appearance today owes much to the restoration in 1905, after removing a 19th century facade which had concealed this wonderful timbered frontage. Prince Henry's room was acquired by the Samuel Pepys Club as a museum in which they display memorabilia of this famous diarist who was born on Fleet Street. In just 10 years, he wrote his very personal diaries, chronicling both the Great Plague and the Fire of London. Not surprisingly, our time trail involves a pub, of which there are still a fair number down Fleet Street, many of which were frequented by journalists in the centuries to come. Down Wine Office Court, our chosen hostelry is Ye Old Cheshire Cheese, which suffered damage from the Fire of London in 1666. It was rebuilt the following year and appears to have been open ever since. Quite possibly it's London's most famous pub, and has been around since the days of Samuel Pepys and Christopher Wren, nourishing such luminaries as Samuel Johnson and Charles Dickens. Because it's situated on Fleet Street, there are many literary associations with the Cheshire Cheese. It's been described and quoted in many novels over the centuries, even before the first newspaper arrived. The pub's unique and wonderfully gloomy interior sprawls out over at least 4 levels. The dungeon-like lower vaults are by far the oldest part and are thought to belong to a 13th century Carmelite monastery which once occupied the site. The pub is currently owned and operated by the Samuel Smith Brewery, and the range of food and drink is straightforward and inexpensive. With maybe a dozen rooms, no phone signal, and to confuse things further, a pub of similar name 500 yards away, this is about as challenging a rendezvous point as any in London.
This is turning out to be a pub crawl, isn't it?
It's always a pub crawl.
If you look carefully above the right-hand bar as you come in, you'll see Polly, a stuffed African grey parrot. For around 40 years, she lived and squawked in Ye Old Cheshire Cheese. Polly's popularity, particularly with newspaper men, was her ability to speak obscenities, with the Kaiser rumoured to be the favourite. The fame of the Fleet Street parrot was so widespread that on her death in 1926, around 200 newspapers across the world wrote an obituary. Often referred to as the Cathedral of Fleet Street, St Bride's Church was also the victim of the Great Fire. Like nearby St Paul's Cathedral, it was also rebuilt to designs by Sir Christopher Wren. The famous steeple stands 226 feet high and is said to have inspired the creation of the multi-tiered wedding cake by a local baker. The original Old Bell Tavern was built as a hostel by Wren to house his workers who were engaged to rebuild St Bride's. At the western end of Fleet Street is the statue of a griffin, marking the start of the City of London. Previously on this site was the Temple Bar, also built by Wren to restrict horse-drawn traffic down the busy thoroughfare. So how did Fleet Street acquire its name? Well, at the eastern end there is a natural dip in the landscape. This was once the course of the notorious River Fleet, flowing down to the Thames from the health ponds on Hampstead Heath. Today it's known as one of the lost rivers of London, but still exists underground. Joined by other tributaries and sewage tunnels beautifully crafted in brick by the Victorians, the river's odour still wafts up from the pavements from time to time. The Fleet meets the Thames under Blackfriars Bridge, but you can't see it even if you really wanted to, because a new sewage system is being developed below it.
The birth of the modern newspaper can be traced to a house that once stood just about here on the eastern bank of the fetid River Fleet. From 1702, overlooking the sewage, dead dogs and suicide victims that clogged the waterway, England's first daily newspaper press, the Daily Courant, thumped, clanged and squelched out the news to the city's eager citizens.
It was just one product of a media revolution at the dawn of the 18th century. After the abolition of pre-publication censorship laws, a prolific newspaper press had burst into life. By the mid-1730s, 31 newspapers were being hawked on the streets of London. Journalists were free to criticise government policy or satirise the church without ending up in jail. The press boom had created a news frenzy, and London now boasted the biggest, freest and most profitable press in the world. Fleet Street was perfectly placed between the city, the law courts and Westminster for its reporters to gather news. Stories were exchanged in the numerous coffee shops and alehouses down its narrow alleyways. One man associated with the literary trade was Dr. Samuel Johnson, who, with the help of others, compiled the very first English dictionary. His 300-year-old rented home on Gough Square is now run by a partner of the National Trust, and you can visit this magnificently restored townhouse. It contains a research library, restored interiors, and a wealth of original features. It's a hidden gem in a wonderfully quiet spot, not far from the bustle of Fleet Street. Across the square is a statue of Hodge, Dr. Johnson's beloved cat, sat on a dictionary, remembered as a very fine cat indeed. St Dunstan's Church on Fleet Street was also spared damage from the Great Fire of London and is loaded with many historical artefacts. Its frontage is hemmed in by ex-newspaper offices, all jostling for position on London's notorious thoroughfare.
Now, number 186 is a rather infamous address from the past. This is where, in the late 18th century, you could get your hair cut and probably a very close shave. Because this was the premises of the demon barber of Fleet Street, Sweeney Todd.
He set up a barber's shop here with the famous revolving chair, allowing his victims to be ejected into the basement below. In his time, the evil Sweeney Todd robbed and slit the throats of over 150 customers right under the noses of the press and the law courts. With his lover and accomplice Marjorie Lovett, he unearthed a monastery tunnel leading from the cellar of his barber's shop beneath St Dunstan's Church and ending under Bell Yard at Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. It was said at the time, "Oh, those delicious pies! There was about them a flavour never surpassed and rarely equalled. The paste was of the most delicate construction and impregnated with the aroma of delicious gravy that defied description." This grim tale was first serialised in a Fleet Street penny dreadful news sheet and became a staple of Victorian melodrama and London urban legend. It was all utter fiction. Right next to Bell Yard stands the old Bank of England, still looking for all the world like a financial institution. Dave suggests we go inside for refreshment. This is a must-see when you visit this part of London. 2 taverns were demolished in 1888 to make way for the construction of the Law Courts branch of the Bank of England. They traded here for 87 years, until 1975, when the premises were sold to a building society. In 1994, London brewers Fuller, Smith and Turner took over the lease and began a major refurbishment, with the aim of restoring the splendid building to its former glory. We take a look at the menu, but decide to eat later. But what many visitors don't know about lies below the magnificent bar room. The old Bank of England's basement still contains the original vaults used to store bullion and indeed some of the crown jewels during the First World War. Whilst two of the huge strong rooms have now been changed to hold the cellars and kitchens, the main vault is intact and still contains the huge steel bullion cupboards. These days the contents are treasures of an alcoholic nature. In the mid-19th century, after various newspaper taxes were abolished, prices on the street were slashed and the success of the industry dramatically increased.
Look at Fleet Street in 1890. It's still as busy.
Well, it's even busier if you ask me.
Chocker.
By the 20th century, Fleet Street was known as a national and international centre for journalism. Papers like the Times, Express, Telegraph had become huge concerns. The Sun allegedly took its name from Vincent de Voorde's trademark. Famous journalists like T.P. O'Connor and Edgar Wallace are remembered in the street. By the 1930s, the majority of British households bought a daily paper produced from here. Prosperous publishers built wonderful palaces along each side. The Daily Telegraph edifice was designed by Charles Elcock and must have been seen as bold, modern and thrusting when it was built in 1928. Above the entrance are winged messengers spreading Britain's news to the globe. Higher still, the incredibly ornate clock tells the time to the whole street.
Several doors down is the Daily Express building. Now, some people think of it as one of London's sexiest buildings. Other people think of it as a brooding harbinger of something bad. Whatever your thoughts, it's Grade 2 listed and was built in 1932.
Designed by Ellison Clark in vitrolite and clear glass, it's one of the most prominent examples of Art Deco architecture in London. There's so much history in Fleet Street, and most of the alleys or courts still remain. The enticing, tightly knit network of back streets around Fleet Street had become the embodiment of the British press and were notorious as much as the bustling offices full of hacks as it was for the numerous smoky alehouses frequented by them. It's such a pleasure now to read the plaques of where the great British newspapers once published to millions of readers. But technology has a habit of breaking with tradition. With new electronic methods, Fleet Street's demise began in 1986, when Rupert Murdoch declared operating from here was no longer profitable. He moved publication of his News International titles, The Times, News of the World and The Sun, to new premises in Wapping, and electronic printing began. The following year, the Telegraph left its mock Egyptian palace for Canary Wharf. In 1988, the Daily Mail made the move to West London. Today, the street is a pale imitation of its former self, and the prestige printing offices have been taken over by new companies. But it's testament to the impact of the 18th century media boom that Fleet Street endures as a symbol for the newspaper industry, even though no newspaper is published here. Well, not quite. Scottish publisher D.C. Thomson still runs a publicity office on the site of Sweeney Todd's Barbershop, number 186. They still promote their historic and most popular comic, The Beano, which has entertained children with Dennis the Menace, Minnie the Minx and Roger the Dodger since 1938. Well, we're getting a bit hungry and Dave's not keen on pies right now, or getting a haircut for that matter.
Well, that's about it for Fleet Street.
Yeah, and what a really interesting day it was.
It was. I think we should finish our pub crawl before we go back to Blackfriars Station.
Yes, well then can we go to the Art Deco pub? I've always wanted to go opposite.
I reckon we can.
It's rush hour now, and with hordes of commuters heading towards the station, we make a beeline for the Blackfriar. It's only 6:30 on a Monday, but already it's crowded. The Grade 2 listed public house was built in around 1875 on the site of a former medieval Dominican friary. It was remodelled in about 1905 by the architect Herbert Fuller Clark. The beautiful building was almost demolished during redevelopment in the 1960s until it was saved by a campaign spearheaded by Poet Laureate Sir John Betjeman. We order fish and chips and start to plan our next outing.